The Atari Jaguar is a console whose failure is seen as a hilarious final attempt by Atari to break into the console market after their numerous previous failures. A console advertised by adding up the bits of all the internal processors ended up flopping terribly, with bad games which ran poorly with subpar graphics. But have you ever wondered why it failed? I mean, nobody goes out and intends to make a bad game console. Well, you see, Atari kinda put a foot in their mouth and utterly decimated their chances of winning the console wars by launching too early. Now, Sega did this to a lesser capacity, but Atari is the king of failing downwards. Another year in the oven would have ironed out all the kinks, and you would have at least had a Saturn-tier console. You know, still commercial failure, but with some really good games at least. In this video, I'd like to go over the many hardware flaws the Jaguar had, which by the way is the reason why it failed, along with what I would have done to fix it. I've read through Beyond 3D forums, the Atari Jaguar development manual, Giant Bomb, and a bunch of things developers including John Carmack said about the console so I could figure out what the hardware and software issues truly were. To begin, we should look over the Jag's architecture first. It contains a main CPU, the Motorola 68000 running at 13.2 MHz, it's 16-bit externally and 32-bit internally. It's basically the same one used in the Sega Mega Drive, just a little faster. And it's basically meant to run as a manager for the rest of the console. The console features 2 MB of unified DRAM on a 64-bit bus hooked up to Tom's memory controller. Who's Tom? Well, one of the 2 custom chips, of course. Running at twice the 68000's clock rate, at 26.6 MHz, Tom contains a 32-bit RISC GPU, a 4KB scratch pad, an object processor, which is a 64-bit RISC chip that is a sprite engine, tile map engine, and bitmap display, and it also sends stuff out to the display. It also features a blitter, which is a 64-bit RISC chip, again, which would this time calculate 3D geometry and other similar things at high speed, but only down to primitives, not triangles. It featured Z-buffering, GURAD shading, texture mapping, and 64-bit internal registers. Tom also featured a memory controller, which was hooked up to those 2 MB of RAM. Now, what's the point of Tom without Jerry? Well, we also have a second chip, called Jerry. Jerry also ran at the same clock rate of 26.6 MHz, and contained a digital signal processor, a 32-bit RISC chip with an 8-bit scratch pad. It was basically the same core as the GPU, but it wasn't just limited to graphics. It also had a sound chip that could handle CD quality sound, it had a DAC and synths, but all of that would need to be programmed in software. It also featured clock control, UART, timers, and joystick input reads, all of that sort of stuff, and the console also featured a port to connect the Jaguar to other Jaguars for multiplayer games like Doom. Tom and Jerry also featured DMA units so they could try to access memory themselves. However, they couldn't. So, what are the problems that this console had? Well, there's too many to count. The Nintendo 64 will look flawless in comparison to this marvel, in the worst possible way. So the Jaguar had a very slow bus. The 68000 was woefully inadequate, and that was basically the reason for the slow bus, and it killed most of the performance. We'll get to this later. Everything was connected to the bus, including the 2 MB of unified memory hooked up to Tom. Tom still had to access the memory through the bus, and the memory controller had a hardware bug that made it so Tom could not access the memory directly. Neither could Jerry. They had to be copied to their 4KB and 8KB scratch pads first. This is why Carmack could not access the memory directly, and he had to split the rendering code of Doom into 9 different pieces to fit on Tom. Furthermore, a lot of CPU-driven operations were required. While this made the system more flexible, it also made it harder to program and slower. This is easy to see with how the sound had to be entirely done in software. The blitter could only display primitives that are based off of fine-grained linked lists. Basically, this means it can't actually draw polygons, and working on it was slower. It also had no texture cache. Every texture map had to be reloaded from RAM, which again was slow because of the slow bus. Furthermore, it took 11 cycles to render a textured pixel. That's terrible. The RISC engines themselves had design hazards, such as write after write. Basically, if you write to memory address A and then memory address B, memory address A will be overwritten. As mentioned earlier, the RISC cores could essentially only use their scratchpads as RAM, 4KB in Tom and 8KB in Jerry. Because of that, they had no cache at all. They could only have minuscule amounts of RAM. So, let's say you want to go about making a game for the Jaguar. Well, here's how terrible the bandwidth was. We'll assume maximum programming knowledge, which many developers at the time didn't have. You can use the Jerry DSP to do all the 3D math, while Tom babysits the blitter because the blitter cannot draw polygons, only spans, and needs full RISC attention to run at full speed. The DSP has a miserably slow bus, so already 50% of it is used to just read the models and polygon lists. Then again, you need to texture map, and you're using 2.4 million pixels per second, but because of the peaks that those require, the peak transmits that need full bus speed, and we're already using 50% of it, we're using even less fill rate, which means that drawing pixels is very slow. Considering we actually need a game, we need game logic, which is obviously complicated, especially for a 3D game. 100% of our risks and 100% of the main bus is already used for rendering. We can't use the 68K because it can't run parallel with the DSPs. We also can't use the DSP for game logic because it reduced too much bus capacity, and the GPU can't be used because it's entirely used to babysit the blitter. We also need sound, because we don't have a dedicated chip or anything. We need custom code and like 15% more bus capacity. Oh, and if we want to have video on the screen, we have to output it at 60 FPS. If we're doing the standard 320 by 240 at 16 bits, we need like 5% more bandwidth. The difference between a game demo and an actual game with gameplay is like 50% of the performance. That is the difference between like 30 FPS and 15. So yeah, the console was crippled, but how do we uncripple it? How do we make it grow back its legs? Well, first of all, we should fix bugs on Tom and Jerry, such as making sure that write after write doesn't cause issues, and so that they can, along with the CPU, access the RAM directly. Speaking of the CPU, get rid of the 68,000. It's shit and it's slow. Swap it to a Hitachi SH2 running at the same speed as Tom and Jerry. Double the 68,000's clock rate. This would make it so you had way more performance. An additional DSP inside the SH2, and other features like actual cache and more instructions that could drastically improve game logic. And we would not be just doubling the speed of the main bus, because the actual SH2 is way faster than just double. Furthermore, add a second memory bus for audio and game logic, preserving the first faster one entirely for graphics data. This was already done on the Jaguar 2.0 prototype that was never released. Also, Tom, Jerry, and the SH2, as stated earlier, have their own DMA units, which means they could load data by themselves for themselves, without needing to wait. Now, in the Jaguar, these were buggy, and if they weren't bugged to hell and back, they could actually be usable and quite competent. Now to deal with the blitter. Add a buffer to the blitter so it can reuse textures loaded with 64-bit reads, so it doesn't have to hit the DRAM every time. If you think the Nintendo 64 having a 4KB texture cache that couldn't load textures in multiple cycles was bad, the Jaguar didn't have a texture cache. Also, you should, along with that, add the ability that the blitter can draw entire triangles without the help of the GPU. That way, the GPU could do less work. Also, add FIFO registers to the GPU and blitter so they can be decoupled and again be more independent. Most of this was done on the Jaguar 2.0. Also, add a dedicated hardware sound chip connected to the audio bus, as it would drastically help in freeing up Jerry. Another few things I'd argue would drastically improve performance on the Jaguar would be basically the clock speed and all of our 3 components could now be increased. Because of some bugs they couldn't do it, but because we're fixing the bugs, we could say that Tom, Jerry, and the SH2 could all be running at 35 MHz, and I've confirmed that Tom and Jerry could have run at like 40 MHz. And I've seen reports of the SH2 running at higher clock rates. So basically, this would make the SH2 actually comparable to the PlayStation 1 CPU in performance, with Tom being pretty fast and Jerry being pretty fast. I'd also argue we should replace the 2 MB of DRAM with 2 MB of Edo DRAM for faster read times, as we actually now have a bus that can benefit from that. I would also argue adding 1 MB of RAM to Tom and 1 MB of RAM to Jerry, as this could drastically lower wait times required to move data around between the main RAM and processors. If the RAM was dual ported, this could make it so both the CPU and Tom, or Jerry, could read from that memory at the same time. As Jerry has audio stuff in it and I/O stuff in it, the RAM could be used to store audio data, like sound effects in games. Meanwhile, Tom could have textures and other graphical things stored directly there after they were worked on by the blitter. If this memory was only accessible by Tom and Jerry, this would drastically lower the amount of bandwidth that was being used on the main bus. That's the console. The new one. Now with Atari, they should have just provided more proper documentation and development tools, compilers that let them work in C more easily, libraries, SDKs, the whole lot. I think if you did all of that, I'd argue that the Jaguar could have been a competitor with the PlayStation 1 and Saturn. Releasing a little earlier would have helped. Instead of releasing in 1993, when the Jaguar did, I'd argue releasing exactly a year later, in 1994, in the West, would have been a bit of a help. Now, if we would include the Jaguar in the console race, this would have drastically changed the 5th console generation. If we assume that the Saturn would launch a year later, in 1996, with the specifications of my Saturn video, which if it's out right now, I'll link to it in the description and in the top right corner, go check it out for more context. By the end of the console generation, the PlayStation would have sold 70 million units, the Saturn would have sold 40 million units, the Nintendo 64 would have sold 22 million units, while the Jaguar would have sold 18 million units. Not bad, even for last place. This is assuming that the amount of people who would have bought these consoles is still around 150 million, because that's roughly the amount of people who bought them in our world, of course. You could make actually a decent chunk of arguments that the numbers would be higher, because a lot of people who would have bought a Sega Mega Drive or a Super Nintendo would have instead bought the humble Jaguar, who released in 1994. And that's going to be about it. I have quite a few videos like this in the works, some of them on old hardware, some of them on mid-2000s recording techniques. If anything comes of it, you'll see it in the tech playlist. Until then, goodbye.